Good morning. If we haven't met, my name is Ryan Bestelmeyer. I'm the lead pastor here at Refuge Church. It's good to be with you this morning. Before we get into the sermon this morning, I do want to talk a little bit about our monthly theme. Our monthly theme for September is investing in Refuge. And yes, what we mean by that is we want you to give money to Refuge Church. And I realize on saying that and just feeling the awkwardness and tension in that room once I use the word giving or money, I realize by saying that it can come across as self-serving, and I want to let you know that it is. It does, in fact, serve me, but not because, your money goes straight into my bank account or the more you give, the more I make. There might be some churches that work and operate like that. They usually don't for very long, but I've never been a part of one of those churches. But it is the case that the staff, the paid staff, and the leadership of this church, which is serving you and serving the kids' ministry, serving youth, putting on Sunday morning worship and everything, as we are serving you, this is one of the primary ways in which you serve us. We are knit together in this interdependent relationship. And as we serve you, one of the ways you serve us is by giving generously and sacrificially. What it does do when you give even more than you currently give is it gives us the opportunity not just to continue doing ministry, not just keeping the lights on and keeping our rent paid in this space, but allows us to take part-time people, increase their hours to half-time, or add on new positions to help us continue moving forward in new ministry. Some cool things are going on here. Just last week, we had our youth kickoff. We had more students at our youth Tuesday night than we ever have before. God is doing some cool stuff at Refuge Church, and one of the ways, people sometimes will say, how can we, support the staff at Refuge? And there's lots of different ways, but what I like to say in response to that is the best way you can support the staff at Refuge is to give sacrificially and beneficially. It takes the stress off us of wondering what we're going to need to cut in terms of our budget and gives us more resources to continue moving forward. The easiest way you can give is by going to our website, refugeabq.com. And I do just want to challenge you, if you've never given to Refuge Church, would you prayerfully consider giving occasionally? If you give occasionally, would you prayerfully consider giving regularly on a recurring monthly basis? If you are a regular or recurring giver, would you consider prayerfully increasing your donation so we can continue moving forward? With that said, we made it through. No one died, right? So let's now pray and ask God to speak to us this morning. God, we just come as your children, and we need a word from our good Father. Would you take the words of the Bible, enliven them by the power of your Spirit, speak them very personally and particularly to all of us, that we might leave here nourished, encouraged, uplifted, challenged, ultimately transformed, that we might look more like Christ, in whose name we pray. And all God's people said, amen. There is one scenario, and I face it a few times a year, when I can't wait for morning to come and to finally wake up. And no, it's not Christmas Day. It's not my birthday. It's not, and this is going to shock you, but it's not Sunday mornings when I get to see all your lovely faces. It's when I'm either camping or backpacking, and it's the very first night. Just a few weeks ago, right before school started, my daughter Aubrey and I went on a backpacking trip near Durango, and as is typical for our annual father-daughter backpacking trip, we bit off more than we could chew. We left our house at 6 a.m., drove up to Colorado to the trailhead, started hiking around 10:30, and by mile 12, we were exhausted. We'd been hiking for probably 8 hours or so at this point. We'd gone a few thousand feet up in elevation. The air was thinner, so we weren't getting as much oxygen. And all of a sudden, what I saw prior to our trip as a slight possibility on my weather app was now a full-blown actuality. A thunderstorm was hitting us, and not just rain and lightning, but hail too. So we got out these cheap ponchos that I didn't think we'd ever need to use. They're designed to cover humans, but not humans wearing large backpacks. We look totally ridiculous, kind of like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, covered in trash bags essentially. And this is Colorado, not New Mexico, so everyone else on the trail is sponsored by Patagonia, decked out in $2,000 worth of waterproof gear. Anyways, the hail was beating down on us. We finally got to mile 14, which is where the ridge ridge we were hiking along was supposed to, according to my plan, open up into this broad valley so we could finally stop to camp. But then I studied the map and the GPS tracker on my phone more closely, realized we had 2 more miles to go. The weather was getting worse. The trail was slippery. Even with our ponchos, our arms and legs were soaked. We were cold. The sun was setting. The sky was darkening. This was not a good situation. So I told Aubrey, but I was really just telling myself. I said, all right, listen, we're in a dangerous situation. I'm sorry. We have to get to that valley. We have to get there fast. No more stopping. No more complaining. No more feeling sorry for ourselves. Let's go. We did. We made it. We finally got to the valley. We set up our tent in the rain. We got inside. We dried off. We warmed up. I laid my aching body down onto my sleeping bag, so tired, so ready to go to sleep, except for one thing. This was our first night. And I can never sleep on the first night of backpacking or camping. And so I laid there. I just turned from one side to the other. Maybe I'd sleep for 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there. But the night was so maddeningly long. And even though we'd had such a rough hike the day before, even though my body was so tired, all I wanted was for morning to finally come so I could just finally wake up. Do you know the experience? When the night is so maddeningly long and all you want is for morning to come so you can finally just wake up. We're in a series titled Everyday Spirituality, and in this series, we're looking at the stuff of everyday life, the practices we engage in almost every single day. And we're asking the question, what does this have to do with God? What does this have to do with our life with God? If we were made for relationship with God, to walk with Him at every moment of every day, well then what does it mean to walk with Him when we eat and when we work, when we shop and when we play? What does it mean to live with God in the everyday stuff of life? Author Annie Dillard once observed, quote, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives." How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. If that's true, and I think it obviously is, then this series offers us the opportunity to consider whether we spend our days and hence our lives with God or without. The first week we talked about sleeping. Last week we talked about dreaming. This morning we're going to focus on waking up. Waking up. Now, I have to admit that this is not my favorite subject. And the reason this is not my favorite subject is that mornings and I do not get along. Can I get a witness? Anybody outside of that dreaded first night of backpacking or camping? I hate mornings. Mornings and I are rarely on speaking terms with one another. We're constantly in conflict. We would have destroyed each other years ago had it not been for the persistent mediation of our mutual friend, coffee. Coffee, and coffee alone, keeps me and mornings together. Somewhat. If you ever interact with me early on Sunday mornings before the service and it appears I don't like you, don't take it personally. I don't like anyone, including myself, before 11 a.m. There is a surprising amount of material in the Bible that mentions my archenemy. It's a surprising amount of material in the Bible that involves mornings and waking up. And there are essentially, what I found are 4 things that we learn about mornings and waking up from the Bible. We'll begin with a passage from Genesis 9. And just to set the scene for you before I show you the text, Noah and his family have recently survived the flood. They've started life over. And here's what happens next. Verse 20 of chapter 9. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk. And he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." This, by the way, is what Old Testament scholars call an etiology, which is a story that explains later historical and political realities, namely the dynamics between later Israelites and Canaanites. Now, we're not sure exactly what it means that Ham saw the nakedness of his father. That could be literal, and maybe it is, or it could be a euphemism for something worse. There is biblical evidence for it being a euphemism for something worse. If you're interested, come up to me after service and I'll whisper it in your ear. But nevertheless, Noah gets drunk and he wakes up and he discovers his son, Ham, has done something shameful to him. And so what does he do? Well, of course, he curses him, right? That's what you would do. And this leads to the first point. Mornings are when you sober up. Now, I mean this both literally and figuratively. Mornings are, of course, when, if you've had too much to drink the night before, you sober up and then you have to deal with whatever happened while you were drunk. Besides the story of Noah, another example of this is from later in Genesis chapter 29. Jacob, the father of the Israelites, met the woman of his dreams in Rachel, and he intended to marry her, but the bride price set by Rachel's father, Laban, was 7 years of service and labor. You may remember us teaching this story in the spring. Jacob worked those 7 years, and here's what happened next. Chapter 29, verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. And when he went into her, Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Now, this is a confusing story just on the surface, because although Leah would have been, veiled during the marriage ritual, how would Jacob not have known it was Leah and not Rachel when they consummated the marriage? The likeliest explanation for how Jacob was tricked is hinted at with this line, "So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast." You could translate that, he threw a huge party. Similar to the situation with Noah, the likeliest explanation is that Jacob was drunk. And when morning hit and he sobered up, he realized he'd been tricked. So when I say that mornings are when you sober up, and by the way, I hope you know I'm not saying that drunkenness is okay. I think the two stories we just looked at indicate the opposite. But when I say that mornings are when you sober up, I mean that literally. But of course, I also mean that figuratively. Mornings are when you have to come to terms with reality, when you have to come to terms with some negative nighttime reality. So in Genesis 41, we mentioned this last week, Pharaoh had to come to terms in the morning with a troubling dream he had the night before. It says that when he awoke in the morning, all morning his spirit was troubled. Pharaoh had to come to terms with reality. In that case, it was an impending famine. Second, mornings are when you try again. If you weren't here last week, we looked at Genesis 20. And in Genesis 20, a king, Abimelech, had a nightmare in which God threatened to kill him because he had taken Abraham's wife Sarah as his own. Here's what it says then happened the very next morning. Genesis 20, verse 8. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all of his servants, and told them all these things, meaning the dream. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Settle where it pleases you." So here, after having this troubling nightmare, Abimelech woke up and then he made amends for the previous day's mistake. Do you see that? He tried again. Mornings represent an opportunity to make amends, to start over, to try again. Now, there is a danger here to this starting anew because it doesn't always go as planned. Sometimes people wake up in the morning, they realize their previous day's mistake, and then as they try to fix things, they only make matters worse. So, for instance, in Numbers 14, God told the Israelites in the wilderness, go into the promised land. I'll protect you against the Canaanites. But they refused because they were scared of the Canaanites living there. And so God responded and said, fine, have it your way. Don't go. You'll just wander around in this wilderness for an entire generation. And here's what happened next. Numbers 14, verse 39. When Moses told these words to all the Israelites, the people mourned greatly. They rose early in the morning and went up to the heights of the hill country, saying, here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. So before we go on any further, do you see what's happening here? They said the next morning, shoot, we messed up. Let's try again. This time we will go into the hill country where the Canaanites are. But it continues. But Moses said, why do you continue to transgress the command of the Lord? That will not succeed. Do not go up. The Lord is not with you. Do not let yourselves be struck down before your enemies. What happened next is that the Israelites ignored Moses. They went up and attacked the Canaanites and were soundly defeated. Listen, the Israelites followed yesterday's disobedience with more disobedience. They were trying that next morning to cover for what happened the day before. They were trying to start over and make things right, but you see, they missed the real issue. The real issue wasn't attacking or not attacking the Canaanites. The real issue was their obedience to God's voice. And the next morning, they only made matters worse. Another example of making matters worse after waking up and realizing what you did the day before comes from the story of David later in the Old Testament. We're not going to look at the text, but in 2 Samuel 11, King David impregnated the married woman Bathsheba. So David called her husband home from the battlefield, got him drunk, and then sent him to his house, hoping that he would sleep with his wife Bathsheba and thus cover over what he had done. But in the morning, David found out it didn't go as planned. The husband had never even entered his house that night. David found this out and decided upon a new tactic to cover things up, so he wrote a letter again that morning that ensured the husband's murder on the battlefield. He made things worse. Now, what does this have to do with waking up? Sometimes when you wake up, you realize the wrong you'd done the day before, but instead of doing right, instead of confessing and repenting and truly changing your mind, changing your direction, you just try to cover up your mistake, and it always makes matters worse. The point here is that because mornings represent a new start, you have a critical decision to make when you first wake up. You have a critical decision to make as you realize yesterday's wrongdoing, whether you're going to continue in that path or truly turn around. Number 3, mornings are when you see the power of God. Mornings are when you see the power of God. So 2 weeks ago, when we talked about sleep, I mentioned that although we sleep, God doesn't. Not only does God not sleep at night, but nighttime is one of his favorite times to work. When humans are asleep, lying still, doing absolutely nothing, that's one of God's favorite times to actively work. And what that means then is that mornings or waking up are those moments when people have a chance to recognize God's nighttime activity. I'm going to show you a text from 1 Samuel 5 in just a moment, but just to give you the context for this passage, the Ark of the Covenant, which the Israelites considered to be the very throne of God, was captured by the Philistines in battle. And the Philistines took their ark, brought it into their own temple of their god Dagon, and here's then what happened next. 1 Samuel 5, verse 3. When the people of Ashdod, those are the Philistines, rose early the next day, there was Dagon, fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off upon the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. So in the morning, the people of Ashdod, the Philistines, saw the results of Yahweh's nighttime activity, namely the defeat of his rival Dagon, represented in the broken statue. That's what God was doing the night before. He was busy defeating his rival. Another example of this sort of thing is in 2 Kings 19 and its parallel account in Isaiah 37. I'm not going to show you the text, but I'll summarize it. The city of Jerusalem was threatened by the Assyrian army. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. And all King Hezekiah of Jerusalem could do was prayed that God would do something at night to protect them. And when morning came, Hezekiah and the other officials looked out, and there, outside the city walls, was a sea of dead bodies. The Assyrian army dead and defeated. In the morning, the Israelites woke up and beheld God's power. Still another example is in Exodus 16, when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. They were hungry. They wanted food. And when they went to sleep, God didn't. When they awoke, they beheld God's nighttime provision. There was manna all around, and this happened day after day for 40 years. In the morning, people can see the results of God's nighttime activity. They can realize God's power. Fourth and finally, mornings are when you embrace your calling. So again, 2 weeks ago we talked about sleep, how sleep is a gift from God. It's not a burden or an obstacle. And I mentioned in that sermon, though, and we're going to go into it now, that although sleep is a gift and it's presented as such in the Bible, too much of it can be a bad thing. So Proverbs 6, verse 6, "Go to the ant, you lazy bones. Consider its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, it prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest. How long will you lie there, O lazy bones? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior." So in this proverb, the writer points out the diligence and hard work of ants, and he uses their example to then criticize the one who sleeps too much. Proverbs 24 says something similar. Starting in verse 30, "I passed by the field of one who is lazy, by the vineyard of a stupid person. And see, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles. Its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior." In both of these passages, we see that sleeping too much can be a habit of self-destruction. Although you stay in bed because that's what feels good at the time, you end up harming yourself and your livelihood according to these passages. The failure to wake up, the failure to get up out of bed, although it feels like cozy self-preservation, doesn't it? It's actually a habit of self-destruction. Proverbs 26 gives us a little more insight into the person who refuses to get up. Starting in verse 13, the lazy person says, "There's a lion in the road. There's a lion in the streets." As the door turns on its hinges, so does a lazy person in bed. The lazy person buries a hand in the dish, is too tired to bring it back to the mouth. So here we see some of the sorry excuses of the one who stays in bed. There's a lion in the road. The idea is that the lazy person will come up with any and every excuse to stay in bed rather than get up. And once again, you see it's self-destructive. Notice the hyperbole there in those last two lines used, that a lazy person can't even lift the food to their mouths. Obviously, that's hyperbole, but the idea is they're starving themselves. They're only hurting themselves. Now, these passages touch on a vice or habit of sin that ancient Christians referred to as acedia, which means literally lack of care. It's often translated into modern English as sloth. But what is it exactly? Or what's underneath it? You know, these ancient Christians understood acedia or sloth to be not just a physical condition, like lying in bed feeling tired. They understood it more deeply to be a spiritual condition. You see, acedia is not mere laziness. Laziness can be a symptom, but it's not the disease. And sometimes what looks like laziness is actually a good thing. It's a virtue, not a vice. So, for instance, ancient Greeks and Romans used to consider Jews lazy precisely because Jews didn't work on Sabbath. They took 1 day a week off from work, and so they were considered by ancient Greeks and Romans to be lazy, but that's not acedia. The kind of laziness in which you practice healthy, God-commanded rest, like taking Sabbath, is not acedia. Here's what acedia is. Acedia is an inner resistance and coldness towards one's spiritual calling or identity and its attendant practices. An intolerable burden to stay true to one's commitment to God with all its daily drudgery and discipline. Another writer says that acedia is the spiritual disinclination to fulfill the demands of love. Let me explain what they mean. Love for God, for oneself, for one's family, for one's neighbor, it makes demands on us, doesn't it? I mean, there is seed to plant and a harvest to gather, as Proverbs 6 said. There's a vineyard to take care of, as Proverbs 24 said. There are chores to be done, clothes to wash, floors to sleep. If you have kids, there are little mouths to feed. At night or at work, there might be spreadsheets to create, lessons to be taught if you're a teacher, surgeries to be performed if you're a doctor. Everyone has a specific and unique way or set of ways in which God has called them to love him and love neighbor. Acedia names that resistance to love's demands. It names that resentment we feel towards the claims that God's love makes on us. So acedia or sloth is a dynamic we certainly might face in the morning, but it's not limited to that. 4th century Christian Evagrius referred to acedia as the noonday demon because he thought its strongest attack happened between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. He describes it as an inner discontent, a desire to leave your place, a desire to check out of reality and find a new one, to flee whatever it is God has called you to do. So, when you're lying in bed in the morning and you don't want to face the day and all of its tasks, well, you're feeling the temptation of acedia. But then later on in the day, when you know you need to make that difficult phone call, when you know you need to respond to that painful email, when you know you need to say you're sorry, or you know you need to reach out to and care for that stranger or that coworker, but you find yourself resisting, that's acedia too. It is a resistance to the demands and drudgery of active love. And this is why, according to a number of writers on the subject, acedia is not just for the lazy person who keeps hitting the snooze button over and over again. Acedia can also drive the person who gets up early and sleeps very little. In her marvelous book, Glittering Vices, Rebecca DeYoung writes this, quote, "The apathetic inertia of the lazy person and the perpetual motion of the busy person could both reveal a heart afflicted by this vice." See, there are two ways you can avoid reality. There are two ways you can avoid your calling and the demands of active love. You can stay in bed, you can just refuse to get up, or you can distract yourself. You can go to bed late and get up early. You can busy yourself, whether by work or hobbies or your smartphone screen, in order to distract yourself and escape reality. Here's the whole point. if acedia is the negative, the temptation you should avoid, then put positively, mornings represent a critical moment, not the only moment, but mornings represent a critical moment to embrace your calling, whatever that is. To get up, get ready, and embrace the demands and even the drudgery of active love. Okay, so how can all of this change our mornings? How might we wake up differently? How might we wake up with God? 4 application points. The first one is specifically for those moments or those days, those seasons when you know you've messed up. Number 1, get up in God's grace and power. When you know you've done something you deeply regret, you broke faith, you lied, you cheated, you stole, you abused, you hurt. When you wake up in the morning and you realize it wasn't a dream, when you sober up, literally and or figuratively, when you come to terms with reality, when you do that, you have a choice to do one of 2 things. You can plan to fix it on your own. You can lie in bed and plot to cover it up, pretend it didn't happen, make it go away, blame someone else, or you can ask God to help you turn around, to repent. You can ask God for a new shot, a new opportunity, a new chance. There's a book in the Old Testament, Lamentations, which is what its title suggests. It's a series of lamentations or laments over Israel's exile. But it's also, in equal parts, a confession. The writer throughout acknowledges Israel's complicity in the exile, acknowledges Israel's sin. And in the midst of his confessing and weeping, the writer says this, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." His mercies are new every morning. And of course, we can take that promise to the bank because of Christ. Because of Jesus, mercy is available every single morning. Because of Jesus, resurrection power is available every morning. If you're trapped in some habit of sin, it's time to wake up, whether in the morning or right now, and move forward in the mercy and power of Jesus to break that habit, break that bondage, get up out of bed, get up off the ground, and try again. So first, get up in God's grace and power. Second application point, ask God to help you up. You know, there are many reasons we might want to sleep in and not wake up, besides sloth or acedia. It might be that we're just tired, that we're exhausted, that we battled insomnia the night before, that our kids kept waking us up. Or it could be symptomatic of some deep sadness, some depression, some grief or pain or hurt when you weren't the perpetrator the night before, but you were the victim. When someone hurt you, when something or someone was taken from you, when you wake up in the morning, it will hit you when your eyes open that yesterday's nightmare wasn't, unfortunately, a dream. And as you open your eyes, you'll have to come to terms with that reality. And in that moment, when it's hard to get up and get going, you can ask God to give you courage and strength and healing. So in Psalm 90, everything is terrible. For the psalmist, the nightmare of yesterday isn't a dream. And so the psalmist pleads with God and says, "Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, so that we may rejoice and be glad all our days." Psalm 143, verse 8, "Let me hear in the morning of your steadfast love." Why do they keep referring to this in the morning? Because they know this reality. When you realize that yesterday's nightmare was not a dream, you need strength when you first open your eyes to receive the day and move forward in it. For those of you in pain, depressed, when the nightmare of yesterday isn't a dream, ask God to help you up. Third application point, see God's power. Waking up is an opportunity, if you're willing to linger in bed for a few moments, if you don't immediately rush off into the shower, it's an opportunity to recognize what God might have been doing at night, how he was protecting, how he was sustaining, how he was nurturing and providing, how he was perhaps even triumphing over your enemies, how he was perhaps waging battle on your behalf, all that he went through without us even knowing to resurrect us each and every morning, all that he went through without us even knowing to ensure that dawn would come so that we might declare with Psalm 118, verse 24, "This is the day now that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." Fourth and finally, embrace your calling. You know, I know that much of life is tedious and frustrating, difficult, boring. I get that, I feel that. But waking up is an opportunity to look ahead and embrace the demands of love with courage. When we wake up, we have the invitation to engage God and to say, "God, give me the energy, the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energy that I need to move forward and do what love demands, no matter the drudgery involved. I don't want to escape God. I don't want to distract. I don't want to numb myself and become apathetic and bitter. Give me all that I need to continue in my calling as a roommate, as a spouse, as a father, as a mother, as a grandparent, as an employee, as a student, as a neighbor. Give me the energy I need to overcome the resistance I feel. And help me, God, today to walk in active love." Would you pray with me? God, we thank you and we praise you that even as our eyes open in the mornings, there you are with us. And as you are present to us, would you help us become more present to you? We invite your presence into that space as we're waking up, perhaps dreading the day to come, perhaps excited about the day to come. When we come to the realization that yesterday's nightmare was not in fact a dream, we ask for your presence, for your help, for your grace and mercy, and may we move forward throughout our day, arm in arm with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.